Hi, you're listening to FREJDA Talks, a sporadically published podcast series focusing on current events and job markets in the field of the social sciences. Hope you enjoy today's episode.
So today's topic is surveillance capitalism, and I have with me here Yannick Deller. Would you want to introduce yourself?
Hi. My name is Yannick. I am currently doing a master's in social anthropology. I'm actually already writing my master's thesis to an extent, and I guess the reason I'm here is partly because I am somewhat writing about today's topic.
Yes.
So I hope to bring some insight or be of value there.
Definitely. So to start with, could you explain what surveillance capitalism is?
How much time do you have?
A brief overview of it.
Okay. Well, come to think of it, like surveillance like in and of itself it's a huge concept, right? It's not just, you can't just really pinpoint it to one thing. It is essentially, I think, like, to put it in Zubov's word, who writes about it, it is a new economic logic that has been emerging over the last, I don't know, couple of decades, maybe like the last 20 years. And essentially, the term surveillance, right, comes in because the new capital, or the new sort of currency in this new economic system, is your behavior, right? So how you behave on a daily basis and how you interact with various devices that are linked or connected to the internet. And that behavior can be observed through data, right? So everything you do becomes data, becomes collectible, becomes mineable, extractable, and that can then be refined into sort of predictive products, predictive models of you. And then the exchange of these products and the exchange of the raw resource, the data you produce on a daily basis, that process there, I think that is what sort of, in very simple terms, describes what surveillance capitalism is.
Okay. So how would we see surveillance capitalism in a day-to-day life?
I think the simplest form, I guess, like everyone has sort of felt or seen, is targeted advertisement. So the ads you get, I mean, it's also a very simple form of how this plays out, right? So based on your behavior, based on, real life locations that you've gone to and that got picked up by your phone, like through geolocation tracking, that kind of stuff, you get specific or specified content, personally created content for yourself. So, if you have a tendency to, I don't know, search for a certain book, for instance, you will get advertisements for that book or for a specific bookstore. So that is just the front of what's going on in the back. And that is sort of the tip of the iceberg that everyone can see when it comes to surveillance capitalism, I think.
Okay. What makes it capitalism or currency?
I think the capitalist part comes in because it is a new logic, right? It's not, and again, like going back to Zubov, who wrote a huge book on it. I think it's like 500 pages plus.
Well,
I mean, when she talks about it, she actually traces it or looks at the different transformations that have occurred when it comes to economic logics or systems. And she there references Karl Polanyi, who wrote about the Great Transformation. And so she says, okay, we're no longer really living, of course, we're not living in the industrial age where sort of like raw, hardcore capitalism sort of started emerging. We're also no longer really living in the information age. We're now moving into, the surveillance age, or what she's calling the fourth great transformation. And that is that exactly behavior can be transformed into data. So for instance, Polanyi, when he talks about the industrialization or that transformation, to him, one of these myths that enabled capitalism was, for instance, that you can transform land into property, right? That can then be bought and sold and can be interacted with in a economic way. So you can rent it, etc. So now Zuboff there is calling it capitalism now, surveillance capitalism, because the same process, the same transformation is happening again. Now it's just not, land, but it's rather how you behave on a daily basis. And in the sense, not just, how you behave in public, but it is ubiquitous. So it happens everywhere all the time. It is, yeah, it's like the ultimate sort of logic or the all-encompassing process of generating value, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do think it does make sense, putting it to kind of like in different ways of how capitalism or currency is viewed. I'm thinking here in a sense that if we put kind of like the data, our behavior data into currency, who's profiting? Or capitalism, because there's always profiteers in capitalism. So if we put this into the surveillance capitalism context, who is profiting and who's being the kind of like exploited part of?
Yeah, so this is a complicated question, like for many reasons. So first of all, like it's not that, or just to clarify, I mean, maybe I said this sort of confusingly in the beginning, but it's not that just your behavior, like your behavior does not, or the data does not become currency, right? So that's not the same. So don't, you shouldn't confuse currency or data with, I don't know, let's say, equivalent here, Swedish crown. So it's not that data is Swedish crown. Rather, you exchange data and the predictive sort of products that you make with that. So the capitalist thing really comes in when it's about the logic that's going on there. When it comes to sort of like who's the exploited party in all of this going on, right? I think that's difficult to say, but put it in easy terms, right? When you I'm sure you heard that saying somewhere before, that when something is for free, when you download an app for free, then it's not really free, but usually you are the product, right? That is not necessarily true, because in this kind of economic logic, you're not the product. You are the raw material. You are the ore that is being mined. And so in that sense, you are clearly sort of like the exploited. But if you drive this logic even further, or sort of this discourse or narrative, you can't even be exploited, because your behavior is seen as a natural resource that is just out there up for the taking. It's not that your behavior is necessarily tied to you as a person. So you can't be exploited. And that makes this whole thing weird. But then also there's the counter argument that what you get in return, like for enabling these services, right? For putting your data out there, for using all these various devices, platforms, apps, whatever, you get something in return. That's personalized content, that is a more convenient lifestyle, that is, usually it's also sold like in terms of health, right? Track your own workout progress, track your own heart rate and all that kind of stuff. It makes you a more productive member of society and a more healthy member of society. So that is usually the counter argument, saying like, yeah, you're not just exploited, right? You also get something in return. It really depends how you view, I guess, human behavior or what we do on devices and platforms, whether or not that is something that's considered like innately belonging to the person itself and like you own the rights to that, or whether it is really something that is out there up for grasps. And just as a final point here, like when it comes to this sort of discourse there, like what is it, human behavior, or how is this formed when we talk in surveillance capitalism? Coldry and Mayas, who wrote a book called The Cost of Connection, they talk in terms of what's going on now is actually data colonialism, and sort of the language that is used by companies who engage in sort of like data mining and that kind of stuff is very similar to how, for instance, the East India Company used to talk about extractable resources. So there it's very clear how data or human behavior as data is seen. And then when it comes to specific actors who profit from this, the data brokers, right? So the ones who actually exchange either the raw resources that they have collected and gathered, and of course the ones that actually refine that raw material into predictive sort of models. Yeah, those are the ones that make a lot of money with that. I mean, the one prominent example where that launched a huge scandal and multiple documentaries would have been Cambridge Analytica, right? And they made a shit ton of money.
Yeah, there's no dispute on that. I'm gonna go a bit back to health and what we kind of profit as individuals from our own behavior and it being sorted in this kind of way. There's been a lot of talk of kind of like surveillance in the era of course COVID-19 now. Some countries having kind of like tracking apps of like tracking whether someone has been if someone has gotten COVID or if someone has been close by to someone who's had COVID and hence there's a chance that they have it. Does this kind of fall into the same category of surveillance capitalism as we kind of think of it in social media apps? Well, yeah, apps in like tracking apps on your phone.
I mean, it is in a way, this is a chicken and egg question, right? What came first? So again, going back to Zuboff, right? When she's talking about how surveillance capitalism like functions or how it emerges, she says, or like she argues that one key point is habituation, or a bit like simpler terms would be normalization. So because of the rapid speed that these sort of technologies, like these apps, platforms, and all that kind of stuff are developing and sort of introduced in our daily routines and lives, we just get used to it. And we just, we accept them. And after all, I mean, they make our lives more convenient, more safe, healthier even. So now whether we are already so accustomed to our data and consequently our behavior being tracked and sort of collected, that leading to us being more accepting of, let's say, COVID tracing apps and whatnot, or if the COVID tracing apps are just sort of like a manifestation of surveillance capitalism, if that's already the norm, how could you not think of something like that given the technological possibilities that we have? So I'm not entirely sure what came first, but my opinion is that I think that because we're already so used to clicking away cookies all the time, not really understanding what actually is going on with cookies, for instance, and because we're so used to being like our data and our stuff being out there that we don't really care anymore. And after all, it is in the interest of public safety, right? And that's always a good way of trying to sell things to the public. It's like, yeah, it's for safety reasons. So yeah.
Yeah, public safety. I think the COVID tracking apps have been sold very extensively like that. We've talked about kind of like the positive sides of surveillance capitalism in the sense of what it is to individual people, especially here in like Western global North countries, convenience on getting targeted ads, which is mostly probably positive, although there might be people who hate that as well. But so if we think of like the positive sides, is there then negative sides? Should we be concerned about surveillance capitalism? Because surveillance oftentimes also has like a bit of negative connotation to the word. So should we be concerned?
That depends entirely on you and like everyone listening. That's a personal sort of choice, or depending on what kind of values you have. But if you read a book such as Zuboff's or like Coldry and Mayer's and sort of like data colonialism, right? I mean, it's quite clear, and I mean, it's no mistake that Zuboff calls it surveillance capitalism, right? Because she's aware of this negative connotation of surveillance. I think as an individual, maybe you don't really have to be concerned, because like, if you're just interested in, you know, living your life, having a good time, yeah, you know, don't worry about it. The problem arises, or you know, when Zuboff talks about it, she says she sees it as a fundamental threat to democracy, to Western democracy more specifically, because to her the biggest problem about surveillance capitalism is that information and knowledge is concentrated in the hands of few. And she puts this very elegantly when she says that, you know, the question we should be asking ourselves is, who knows? Who knows who knows? And who decides who knows? So in that sense, I mean, there's no, you know, like, there isn't, it's not a mistake that children of, you know, like big tech CEOs don't have access, or like their parents don't allow them access to certain apps and platforms, because they do not want them to be on the grid. Now, doing these detox, you know, like endeavors, or like just shutting off Instagram, or you know, like your mail account, or if you're a student, shutting off Canvas and not participating, or now during COVID, not going on Zoom, that is a luxury that not everyone can indulge in, right? So that is only reserved for a select few. Now, more specifically, why she thinks this is a threat to democracy is because it fundamentally shifts sort of the power relations, and it erodes one of the key cornerstones of democratic societies, which is trust. So we don't have to trust each other any longer. We can just look up what's going on. And I mean, a consequence of this, you can, like with targeted content, for instance, is like this increased polarization that is going on right now, like on all the various, you know, social media platforms. So you can live in your own little bubble, and you eventually you stop listening, because you just listen to the ones or to the content creators or platforms that are telling the same story that you already agree with. So that is another part. The biggest issue that she sees is that, you know, like the process or the end goal of surveillance capitalism, or inherent to the logic, is you want to avoid uncertainty. And because uncertainty requires trust, and it always involves a level of risk. Now, avoiding uncertainty, you can do that through predictive models, right? Models, AI enabled and whatnot, that can most accurately predict how individuals or groups will behave in the future, right? Now, that is, you still have some level of risk when you just move by predictive analytics. And Zuboff claims that the end goal is to reach a state of certainty. And to reach a state of certainty, what you need is prediction, but then also behavioral modification, in the sense of that you will behave the way we want you to, right? And that you can do by nudging, which is a common term, so directing people to do, like, go certain places, behaving in certain ways, buying certain things. That is, for instance, when you type in, like when you search for something on Google, it only shows you certain results. So it's trying to silo you off and only allow a limited numbers of sort of branches that you can behave in, and sort of like direct you in that way. And that is sort of the biggest issue, right? That you essentially, free will is dead. You do however the corporate overlords want you to do, right? And that is the biggest threat. And that is also where power becomes, or knowledge becomes power, so that you can actually steer an entire population to do certain things that which they would otherwise not do, based on information and prediction and then modification.
So if we think about the data that is mined through our behavior in online, I would think that it's my information, it's my behavior, but in this kind of context, I don't necessarily own the data too much. So I would want to discuss a bit on the ownership of the data that is mined through our behavior online.
I mean, the easiest way to answer this question is, why is it that whenever you download a new app or buy a new phone or, you know, subscribe somewhere or open a new account on a social media platform, that you have to agree to terms and conditions, and that you have to agree to cookies, and that you have to agree to privacy policy? Exactly that, because like even the companies behind or offering these services and platforms, they are aware, or they know, and like it's very clear, it's your data, you produce that, it belongs to you, otherwise they wouldn't ask for your permission to collect it, right? So in a way, or on a very fundamental or rudimental level, it's clear what belongs to whom. However, in public, that discourse shifts a bit, because then it becomes, well, like there's 2 points. Well, and the first one is, well, you know, it's just data exhaust. You know, we can't really say anything without it before we do something with it. So it's just, again, going back to a raw material that is just out there up for the taking, and whoever comes first, you know, eats first. So that's one thing. That's like, it's trying to shape that discourse in a specific way. And that ties in with the second one, is that it's essentially useless, right? What do you do? Like, no one really cares. Like, what's the use in this data exhaust? Well, you know, it's not, and like even on an individual level, you might not care how many times you open which app, or, you know, it's not useful to you to know that information. No, you want to see the screen report after, you know, a week's time and see how much you spent in general. That's what you want to see. Like, you don't want to see it or see the detailed information or know it in the moment you're doing it. But you want a product from it, right? So, you know, that's that. Essentially, to me, my opinion is, it's my behavior. I produce that kind of information. So in a way, it's mine, right? So, you know, like when you look at the GDPR, for instance, you know, they try to define what is data. They try to define what is private information, what is private data, what is publicly accessible data. And even there, like you start realizing, it's not as clear, or even their definitions are quite ambiguous after trying. And but it speaks to the point when it comes to, you know, ownership of data, or how data should function. If you look at the very first article in the first chapter of the GDPR, and I'm reading this here from the legal text itself. So it's Article 1, Section 3. The free movement of personal data within the Union shall be neither restricted nor prohibited for reasons connected with the protection of natural persons with regard to the processing of personal data. So, you know, very, like in this article, what this essentially means is, yeah, we define what, you know, private data is. We, to an extent, acknowledge that you have some involvement when it comes to the production of private data as a private citizen or individual. We acknowledge this. But what cannot happen is that we challenge the fundamental logic and process of how this system works. So the free flow of personal information must be guaranteed within the Union. And there's no challenge to that. So even in connection to, from like what the article says, even in connection to the protection of privacy of like natural persons, which means you, me, whoever. So essentially what this article is saying, companies keep doing what you're doing. We just have a little bit of restrictions for you. We grant the citizens a bit more involvement, a bit more, you know, not really power, but we grant the citizens a word. And the right to recall their data that is stored in your databases. Yeah, but other than that, we do not challenge how the fundamental system actually operates. You know?
Yeah, so is it kind of like a bit, put in a simple and maybe crude terms, but illusion of power?
Yeah, and I would say like, not an illusion because it's actually there.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you want to evoke that right, or invoke that right. So like, right, you want your data to come back from, I don't know, or to You want to see what kind of data they store about you, and you want them to erase your database. If you want to do that, oftentimes you have to go through court because they're challenging, right? Or it's a huge bureaucratic process for, I don't know, let's say working class citizen to get that stuff done. You don't have the time nor the energy to be bothered about it, right? So you don't do it. Otherwise, you have to, make compromises here and there and not go to work. Take a day off to actually read into the stuff. Or you do it on the weekends when you're supposed to spend time with your family. But then you tell your kids, sorry kids, today we're not going ice skating. Papa or mama have to read up on GDPR and how to, get our data rights invoked or whatever, right? So you have to make these sacrifices. So in that way, yeah, it's an illusion of power. Although you actually have the right to do something, but, never changes. But then also, it's a bit nonsensical, and there's a very prominent case in Spain. I don't quite remember the details of it, but a person wanted their data to be removed, or it was about the auctioning off of a house, I think. And they wanted their data to be removed, and after extensive, it was pre-GDPR, but after extensive legal battles, they finally were able to get the data removed from a specific platform. However, the entire information was already out there. Newspapers have written about it, so there are physical articles about it. So when someone says on the internet you write with ink, yeah, you do, because even if you get your stuff removed, it is still somewhere, somehow. So how much sense does that really make? But yeah, it just goes to show how normal and accepted the entire system itself is, that even legislation that is supposedly meant to protect the private individual does not challenge the fundamental logic of how the system operates.
Okay, so you mentioned bubbles when it comes to survey or targeted content that people get based on their behavior, and I can definitely see that in my own social media as well, that I follow certain accounts that think the same way as I do, hence I get content that think the same way as I do, and then based on that also other ways, content that is kind of like given to me in a plate is very confirming of my own ideas. There's been a talk about that being like the bubbles kind of contributing to a division of societies and states. And I think this is kind of like the threat to the democracy as well. So if we take, for example, the US since Trump's elections, I think that is one of the easiest examples there. Do you think this kind of like division that is created by targeted content has contributed to it?
Certainly contributed to it. I don't think it's like the sole or the only reason why there's such a huge polarization, especially in the States. I mean, like the States, they have so many issues. I mean, if you work with a two-party system, what do you expect will happen down the road? But I think like the issue is, or to me at least, the issue is that you're no longer forced to listen to each other, right? Because you're constantly in your own bubble, in your own content cloud or whatever. And oftentimes like in ways that you don't even recognize, right? So it's the sort of the subliminal kind of little things that are going on in your daily life, and then once in a while you're confronted with something that's outside of your normal stream of content, and you immediately click it away, or you're curious, you have a look at it, and then you go like, what the hell is this person talking about? Go away, leave me alone. But that, I mean, it's an extreme formulation, right? So I mean, a society such as the US always had huge divisions. But I think what it does, especially now that, today our lives are lived so much more online or in the digital sort of realms, especially now during COVID, it's definitely an amplifier. And, a lot of content on like online is, it sounds a bit weird, but it's clickbaity, right? It is provocative, it is extreme. Extreme not necessarily like in a negative sense, but it's just like it's supposed to make you watch it, it's supposed to make you interact with it. So either sharing it around and saying like, hey, look, have you seen this idiot? Like what he's talking about is absolutely ridiculous. But then that's already a share, and the share that means like, yeah, more money for the guy who created the video. Same goes with likes and whatnot. So that is because of, let's put it this way, because of the commercialization of the digital space, this is even more amplified. So, like, you're actually directed to being more extreme. You're directed to sharing more. You're directed to gather and extract as many likes and views and minutes as possible so you can, make a living by yourself. And because of this process of making everything extreme, coupled with targeted content, everything or every opinion or every bubble gets more and more siloed off, becomes its own environment, becomes its own world, its own reality. And then trying to understand someone else's silo or another social group's silo, forget about that. That's never going to happen, because you're essentially living in two different worlds. It's as if you, as a Finn, as a Finnish person, were trying to speak to a penguin. Well, it's both cold in the places you live, but
they might have as many words for snow as we do.
Maybe. Not sure if a penguin would enjoy a sauna, but like trying to understand each other and sort of also the willingness to understand where that person is coming from. That is essentially just over time. It's like water that runs over stone, right? It's like you don't notice it necessarily in the moment or for an hour when you look at it, but over a couple of years, there is going to be a ditch in that stone, right? The water will just erode the stone over time. And I feel a similar process is happening when it comes to social media and targeted content, especially clickbaity one. Just keeps on polarizing.
Yeah, I'm thinking in a sense when internet, because we're old enough to kind of remember when our families got their first computers, when internet was still like connected to your landline and you had the nice noise.
Yes.
And I remember when kind of like the early ages of very widespread internet, as in like as even low middle class families, etc. Internet was supposed to connect people from all over the place, and I do think that it does to a certain extent, but like as from the baby shoes of when my dad, for example, was finally being able to have video phone calls with his relatives in the former Yugoslavian countries or in Germany, to kind of like, so it broke the boundaries of world and kind of like, this is going to connect people all over the world. But now it's kind of like, sure, connecting in a sense that there's no country boundaries online, but there's like a new set of boundaries of these bubbles.
Well, what's fascinating, like when you talk about the internet and what it's meant to be, right, to connect people. There's a very good book by, James Ball, if I'm not mistaken. I think the title of the book is How the System Works. I read this in my vacations. I don't remember the title correctly. Anywho, and he's a journalist, and so he is always interested in these kinds of like technological developments and whatnot. But then he was curious about, okay, what internet? How does that work? And so he started talking to some of the founding fathers of the internet, which sounds like, it's like 100 years ago, but it's like what, 30, 40 years, something like that. And when he talks to them and sort of shares the interviews in the book, you start realizing that the internet was never meant to be what it is right now. It started off as an experiment, in a university. And essentially it was just about cataloging, research inquiries, if I'm not mistaken. Don't know the details anymore, but it was definitely more the function of an intranet. So a closed off sort of communication platform between universities. And first there were 2 universities, and were 3, 4. The State Department, if I'm not mistaken, funded it. Later, DARPA funded it. So military involvement as well, and they tried to, like, their intentions behind it was to make their, what's it called, the nuclear missile kind of like to have a what would it call, backfall, or like a safety measure, so you can kind of close it off from, you know, external intervention and whatnot. And then what's really fascinating about the book is it shows how, you know, all the protocols that the internet operates by, they were just developed on the go. Like there was never a long-term plan of where is this thing going, what is it supposed to be and do, but that it was just reaction to what was going on. And you know, now what's it's sort of like a natural or unnatural to a certain extent progression and development of what's going on right now. So just like to keep that in mind, the internet was never meant to be what it is right now, and it's vastly too complicated and complex for people to try to regulate and control it. Some have found ways to exploit it, right, for commercial purposes.
So internet is kind of like a ongoing experiment that just evolves into what is society kind of like needs, or what certain people think that the society, for example, needs, or what they need. Thinking if we wrap it up in a sense, we've talked about the early ages of internet and kind of like connecting and dividing people. Something that interests me a lot is, hypothetically, what would surveillance capitalism look like in future? And this doesn't need to be in 5 years or 10 years. The online realm is rapidly changing all the time. But where do you see this going, even in near future?
I don't have a crystal ball with me, but I think I think the process of what has been going on the last couple of years, where you see that more and more seemingly unnecessary sensors have been introduced into our daily lives. So who would have thought, I don't know, 10 years ago, that our fridges need to be connected to the internet, or that a fridge needs to have a Bluetooth function.
Or our toothbrushes.
Or toothbrushes, right? I mean, why, right? But this is a process that has been going on, and you see the benefits in it. Yeah, you get great data from a toothbrush telling you where you should brush more efficiently. A fridge tells you when it's empty, so you don't even have to open it anymore. Similarly, a TV, you know, offers you specified content. So what I think will happen is that more and more of these sensors, you know, those devices that actually gather information, data about you, will be introduced in a real physical life setting. That everything that can be knowable must become knowable. That's one of the imperatives that Zuboff talks about, like extraction and prediction imperative. So, but everything has to be knowable. And this translates into, you know, concepts such as smart city, right, that have been flying around recently and that become more and more get more and more attention, especially in connection to issues related to sustainable development, right? How can we make a city more sustainable? Well, if we know more about the city, we can track where we pollute more, where we're not as efficient as we should be, and then we can just, you know, solve that with magic word, data. So I think that is a very likely development that we're heading towards. Now, the problem there is, I think, is that, you know, all of this data gathering, developing predictive analytics or predictive models, selling those, and consequently developing ever more sophisticated algorithms and artificial intelligence, as well as new sensors, that is proprietary knowledge, right? That is not something that is publicly accessible. Now, when we talk about smart cities, I think there is a real danger that or danger, a potential. I don't want to be an alarmist, but I see the potential that in the future we will have Google cities or Microsoft cities or Apple cities that function based on proprietary technology, where every movement is being tracked and data collected for the benefit of that city or society in general. So that is sort of a development that I see the specific, Western context. Now, what that means is I think you will start seeing a global sort of, or an increase in global polarization as well, where you can clearly specify or identify the rich and powerful, the ones who have access to this kind of technology, and then the exploited. Because, like all the raw resource extract, like physical material, raw material, ore that is needed to develop or even produce, I don't know, computer chips or whatnot, that will be outsourced, or that will be done in quote unquote the global south, or quote unquote the developing world. So I think you will see an increase in polarization / like siloing off in that respect. But then also when it comes to initial processing of such information or content curation, or not censoring, but just flagging bad content, for instance, that already being done in so-called sweatshops, right? In India, for instance, or in Africa as well. So I think you will see an increase there, which, who knows, will spark conflict potentially. No, but I think like if it just continues like as it is right now, it will just expand, and it will expand faster and quicker. Whether or not that is good or bad, I don't know. That depends, like how you see and view the world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable to think about that. I don't think like Western democracies will be pulverized by this kind of economic logic. I just think it will change, and we will have to have a conversation whether or not we want it to change, and whether or not, I think we should ask ourselves the question, just because we can do it, should we really do it? Do we have to just blindly follow technological progress? Or is there a point in time where we have to say, yeah, it's awesome, cool tech, but other things are important as well, or are worth being protected? And I think that is a conversation that is slowly starting to be held, but might already be too late, considering, surveillance capitalism having an advantage or a head start already. So, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna leave you guys on those notes. Thank you so much, Yannick. This has been extremely interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Thank you for tuning in. You can find FREJDA at frejda.org or at FREJDA.org on all social medias.